So we're looking at Milton's Comus, a masque, and with that a play. Unlike last time when we looked at his Nativity Ode, which was written in 1629, this was came out, and Milton himself really was identified as an important an important writer in 1645. He was already important insofar as last time I mentioned he wrote the introduction to the second edition of Shakespeare's complete works, which is not saying nothing then. Probably seems more significant now than it did then because of our estimation for Shakespeare. But having the two great men connected is worthy of mention for sure. That's why I put it on there. But in the midst of the publication of his poems in 1645, he put his authorial identity into the poem, into this masque in some ways. And this was part of the published poems. So on the one side, most of the poems that he'd written up to that point were published, beginning with the one we looked at last time, the Nativity Ode, and ending with Lycidas, which we have yet to read but will read in the coming weeks, Pastoral Eclogue. And on the other hand, he actually had Latin poems, which none of which we're going to look at, but a lot of Latin poems showing himself to be a serious writer, because, and this is hard for us to understand, all serious people are fluent in Latin at this stage. And the whole Reformation, which we associate with the translation of the Bible into the vernacular languages, whether English or German or French or whatever, is nonetheless conducted in Latin. The debates, the epistles that go back and forth are written in Latin. All the reformers with their Catholic opponents, they're writing in the common tongue, because remember they're from different continents. And today people tend in commerce and in global affairs to converse in English. That's because of the influence of the United States. A few decades back, there would have been dispute over whether that would be the case. The UN, of course, they're not going to acknowledge that. They have their translators and all that. But in general, most people today, when they want to interact with people from different cultures, they use English. In Milton's day, it would be Latin. And so he wrote in Latin. He wrote poetry in Latin. To be taken seriously as a poet, you would write in Latin. That practice persisted in European universities and British schools and American schools all the way through into the 19th century, and even into the 20th century, actually, truthfully. So John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, in high school would have not only read Latin, but written in Latin in both prose and poetry. So you had to have a mastery of the language to write poetry in that language, and that was part of demonstrating your fluency, is to write in that language. So those of us who claim to be fluent in a foreign language, how fluent is fluent? You understand everything that's said. You can be perfectly understood as such. You don't have an accent, whatever. Yes, but do you have the cultural fluency to write poetry in that language? Because that's a different level of competence. And actually, most native speakers can't write poetry in their own language. So that's another. So there's a cultural literacy that is part of that as well. I just wanted to say that, and Milton certainly is announcing that in his published poems of 1645. And what he's doing is announcing himself as a part of the European artistic community then. I told you he went to Italy and was greeted as a great poet from England. Had read, obviously, the Italian poets, Petrarch and Dante and so forth, and was able to converse in Italian. But writing in Latin would mean people took him seriously. The language of the educated. The Reformation added to that fluency in Greek and Hebrew. And Milton was conversant with those as well and wrote poetry in those languages. So again, I just want to give us a sense, because it's really easy to overlook it. We have all of the modern aids of translation and editions of works and so forth, and everything's been made easy for us. Technologies has just added another layer of ease. The sheer level of competence to function in Milton's day that you would have to demonstrate to be taken to be as serious as Milton was taken, I think that needs to be impressed upon us. And it's not just Milton. So the famous Queen Elizabeth would also have had the same sort of education. This was a Renaissance education. Read original languages, write in original languages, have understanding of the issues involved in theological. So Queen Elizabeth, again, opining on theological issues, just like Henry VIII, her father, had as well. Conversant with them. We have lost that educated culture. It's very much of an aristocratic ideal that the aristocracy of our day no longer possesses. They've got the wealth, they don't have the erudition. Milton's trying to demonstrate it, and in the middle of that volume, so with the poems that I just mentioned, beginning with Ode on the Morning of Christ's Nativity, and concluding with Lycidas, and on the other side, the other half, all the Latin poems, right smack bang in the middle is this masque that we're looking at today. It has its own title page, and it has its, the laudatory frontal matter in making it highlighting it in some ways, giving it pride of place. And it is really an odd work when you think about Milton in general as a writer, because the general opinion on Milton is that he is a reformer himself. He is a prophetic voice. Remember, the prophets in the Old Testament are always moral reformers. They're always calling people back to the Word of God. They're referring back to Moses and so forth. Milton has that. We've lost sight of the truth here. Let me bring you back to what we really hold true, because there's been slippage there. He tends to be seen as a genius above his age. He's not going to, so when he comes to write Paradise Lost, he's not going to be shackled by the conventions of writing and rhyming couplets. He is going to go back to the ancients, and yet he's going to make it his own. So he doesn't seem to be a man of his age, is the point. He's a man for all ages, but he's not of his age. He seems to stand above that. But this work is very much typical of his age. And it's one that we don't tend to even honor in our day, the Masque as a type of drama. And so it's odd in that sense. But it's not only the culmination of the poetry that he's written up to this point, but it is also very almost mythological, and it has very striking characters, very strong interest in music, which I spoke of last time. But it's evident in this because this would have been performed to music. This was performed as at a wedding as well. So there's a public performance side of that we need to be aware of here. And it was presented, as it says here, at Ludlow Castle in 1634 first. So published in the 1645 poems, but presented at Ludlow Castle, which has highly suspicious associations, by the way, as well. And to a significant degree, it's dependent on English dramatic conventions. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because that in itself is also interesting. And it includes the idea of including a woman on stage, which the Puritans certainly did not do, and the Greeks never did, and the Romans You didn't have women on stage presenting, but in the fashion of the day, they did. But the women who did do this were none other than queens, and Catholic queens at that. So, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, but it's really interesting that the masque as a type of dramatic presentation has a lot of complicated theater and stage devices. We're not acquainted with this. If we're acquainted with drama from this period, we think of Shakespeare, and there's not a lot of staging, and there's not a lot of complex devices, and there's not a lot of intricate costumes, and the music is relatively minimal, so to speak. This type of production is the exact opposite. Heavily staged, artfully costumed, like overly elaborate, like Baroque in its presentation. A lot of dancing, a lot of music, almost like carnivalesque, like overstated, but highly mannered, highly ordered. A lot of silent role playing in it as well, which you sometimes get in Shakespeare's plays. Think of the dumb play in Hamlet and so forth. So inclusion of that. And there's a debate which you may not know about between Ben Jonson and Inigo Jones in preceding this about the proper place of the words of the poet over the theatrical spectacle. There's a debate between the two men. What should have preeminence? Jonson is on the side of the poet's words. Inigo Jones more on the spectacle of the event. But these are part and parcel of the whole masque conventions of the day, this debate. By the 1630s, we see this as a European genre. It's very much this is the high society genre that Milton's engaging with. The popular, when I say popular, amongst the aristocrats, the best form of theater, the most cultivated individuals are interested in masks. So this is not for the commoners, this is for the elite. And it's put on at Ludlow Castle for an aristocrat. So in the court of Charles and his wife, Henrietta Maria, masks are borrowing the conventions from France. France being still Catholic. Again, this is one of the things that's going to irk the Puritans in England, that not only is Charles suspect in his theological views, he's adopting the manners of the Catholic court of France and surrounding himself with all the wrong associations. He's clearly not a Puritan in his tastes, and that bothers them as well. And so that's the interesting thing, is that Milton, who's so well known for his puritanical spirit, is engaging with an artistic form that is so contrary to what we normally associate with John Milton. But masks by the 1630s are borrowing features of pastoral drama, of tragic comedy, of romance, and often have the associations of Edmund Spenser thrown in. So allegorical readings, allegorizing of virtues and characters. But the most significant feature is the one I mentioned just previously. Women are being brought on stage as actors. And that is rather revolutionary. So, and in particular, of significance for the purposes of saying this is very much of a contemporary production, unlike many of his which seem to transcend time. In 1626, Charles' wife, Henrietta Maria, and her attendants acted in a play called Artemis, which is a French pastoral. And in 1633, just prior to this, and this is a topic of great unease to the English court, the queen and her ladies act in a pastoral romance written expressly for them. It's called The Shepherd's Paradise, written by Walter Montague. And the famous Puritan William Prynne denounced this. Prynne wanted the theater to be basically closed, like a strong critic of the Puritans. And Prynne writes an attack on the Queen, for which he is severely disciplined. So I'm just giving you something of the temper of the day. And so the masque is considered to be a woman's form by this point. So this is theater for women, for aristocratic women, or even for regal women. And Milton decides he's going to write a masque. Very interesting. And it is not only political commentary that happens through this, but also social commentary. I say all of that because the general representation of women, of Milton rather, that I've read in Milton scholarship leans towards seeing Milton as at best, having a rather scant view of women, if not being outright misogynist. That's actually more the tendency in the scholarship of the last 50 years, to see Milton as a misogynist, in particular because they probably focus on Paradise Lost and the treatment of Eve in that, and a few comments there. But in general, that view of Milton as a misogynist, the basis for that you also see in his treatment of his wives. I'm not going to go into that in too great a detail. And then also his relationship with his daughters. Remember, and what we know about them popularly is mostly that he dictated his great 3 major poems to one of his daughters, who was effectively, clearly, highly educated. But that sort of relationship. So in general, the portrait of Milton is not flattering with respect to women. So that makes this work particularly significant, at least as far as it addresses that feature as well, because again, this is a type of literature, in this case drama, which is intended for women and in which women act. And so the role of the woman in it is of particular interest and significance. And the fact that politically and socially it's been great interest has been taken by the current Queen of England, and she's even on stage doing masks, already engages Milton in a rather dangerous act of apparent political conflict. He's commenting on a genre that the Queen herself is involved in, so anything he's going to do in that area is going to be perceived as a potential criticism of the Queen. And tensions are high between the king and Parliament. So that all of that's interesting. So when we consider the nature of court productions between the time he wrote the Nativity Ode and this work, we find that masks are in an ongoing dialogue with one another. So this is the final feature, and I'm not going to get into that in any great detail, but it's almost like the theatrical productions of the dramatists are speaking to other dramas. So it's an interactive production in which the assumption of the writer is that other people you've already seen that other mask. Now here's my mask in response to that mask. And we're not going to have that because we haven't watched the other mask. So we're going to be bereft of that sort of dialogue between works and between other artists. But and what is interesting then here is that Milton clearly did not write for the Queen or the court, but seized on a heroic feminine ideal. And it is feminine. A heroic feminine ideal that is of chastity, and more in keeping with his vision of the ideal Protestant version of femininity is represented in this. And what we see in it, and this is what's so interesting, is that this view of femininity is so potent that it defeats the devil, in a way anticipating even Paradise Lost, where even Paradise Lost fails. Here we have a virtuous woman, just called the lady, who is able to fend off the wiles of the devil through her superior intellect, and most importantly, her chastity, her devotion to God, and her holiness. Her personal holiness is able to undo, in some ways, the effect of the fall, or to demonstrate that she's not affected by it. She's faithful in the midst of temptation, and she has no helper. She's no Adam to come to her rescue. So it's very interesting in that sense for me. And so he's wrestling with many of the problems that his contemporaries are, and increasing self-consciousness of using classical mythology, because classical mythology is always filled with sexual transgression. Like, Ovid's text is probably the foremost in this, but there's always some sort of a rape or sexual transgression between gods and nymphs, usually of some sort, right? Always that goes with the classical mythology. Milton is going to employ the classical mythology, and yet he's going to purify it of all those associations. And so the question then is, a man who has such a high view of the feminine capacity to resist evil, can he really be seen as a misogynist? Is that an oversimplification of our view of Milton? And that's my contention that it is. It's an oversimplification. Milton is not a misogynist. To have written this work, we have to have a little bit more nuance in our view of Milton. I say this because I've had colleagues and friends who really, really hate Milton because of his views on women. And C.S. Lewis likewise, for that matter, because he wrote against priestesses in the church. I'm like, really? That's it? That's all? But anyway, so Milton is writing this, and as I say, he's writing against the backdrop of Catholic examples, but there's one particular mask that he has in sight: pleasure reconciled to virtue, 1618. Where, again, I'm not going to read that there, because in that, Ben Jonson used Comus as a drunkard, as an anti-mask figure. And so Milton has Jonson's work in his sights, and Jonson is the great dramatist of his day, probably even greater than Shakespeare in terms of his contemporaries' judgment. It's not Shakespeare who is seen as the great dramatist in the Jacobean period. It is Ben Jonson. Hard for us to imagine. We don't tend to see many productions of Jonson, although you see some at the RSC. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but Ben Jonson's plays are sometimes put on at the Royal Shakespeare Company back down in Stratford. And he was seen as the preeminent dramatist, and Jonson is a classicist, reads and writes in Latin, whereas the estimation of Shakespeare is that he had little Greek or little Latin and less Greek. So he did not have a very good education, is the sort of standard view of Shakespeare. And Milton seems to go with that. He talks about in his Lycidas, noble Shakespeare fancies child warbling his native wood notes wild. So he's more of an English character than a classically educated universal character. That's the portrait that we get from, actually, I think it might be. It's not, it's L'Allegro or Il Penseroso. It's not from Lycidas. So Milton's engaging with Jonson, and there are differences between them, though. So in Milton's version, there is magic, but it does not reside in the father and his heir, but rather in the daughter of the house. She has a sort of a magical capability. And the convention would have her being silent and representing virtue, whereas Milton presents her as a very vocal character. So again, he gives her a capacity not as a representation of quiet virtue, but rather a intellectually capable defender of her own chastity. So again, it's contrary to the view of Milton not appreciating women's intellect, which you would get from a few lines of Paradise Lost, or you might get at any rate. So let me go on with that. But his favorite play is probably The Faithful Shepherdess by Jonathan Fletcher, and I'm going to skip over that. I want to go to the poem itself. But as I say, the most interesting feature is the lady herself. And Milton asked an adolescent girl to play in that role of the lady in front of the audience. So she's not just a female figure, it is actually a female character that's playing this. And that makes it a really interesting production as well. But without further ado, why don't I engage with the poem itself? There aren't very many characters involved in it. And note the fact that it even mentions those who are the chief personages who were presented there. They were the lords and ladies of the manor at Ludlow Castle, the Egertons. And the first scene discovers a wild wood, and there is an attendant spirit or a daemon. And this is interesting here because the word daemon often can be associated with a demon. But daemon in classical Greek has broader associations than simply what we will call the demonic. It's an attendant spirit. And not all attendant spirits are associated by Christians with demons. So Socrates claimed to have a daemon that would attend him and speak and so forth. We could immediately go, well, if it's a daemon, then it's a demon, but that's not a necessary conclusion, and one that we can say without any further conversation. But it could be sense of this, and as it says here in the very helpful comment, most likely Milton's sense of a daemon follows Socrates from Plato's Symposium, where Socrates teaches that love is not a god, but a great spirit or a daemon. So not a demon necessarily, but it could be a demon. And there's a lot of fuzziness there with respect to this. And in particular, because in this case there is attendant spirit, there's actually demonic activity in the play as well. But anyway, the attendant spirits, it descends or enters, and then it speaks. Before the starry threshold of Jove's court, my mansion is. Again, the reference to Jove's court, and it seems to be contrary to Milton's standard practice to be less attendant on classical conventions, at least when it gets to theological issues. He's not going to go full Spencer and speak of Jove as God, for instance, whereas here it is. So before the starry threshold of Jove's court, my mansion is, where those immortal shapes of bright aerial spirits live ensphered in regions mild of calm and serene air. Above the smoke and stir of this dim spot which men call earth, and with low-thoughted care confined and pestered in this pinfold here, strive to keep up a frail and feverish being, unmindful of the crown that virtue gives after this mortal change to her true servants among the enthroned gods on sainted seats. Yet some there be that by due steps aspire to lay their just hands on that golden key that opes the palace of eternity. To such my errand is, and But for such, I would not soil these pure ambrosial weeds clothes with the rank vapors of this sin-worn mold, but to my task. Neptune besides the sway of every salt flood and each ebbing stream, took in by lot twixt high and nether Jove, imperial rule of all the sea-girt isles, that like to rich and various gems inlay the unadorned bosom of the deep, which he, to grace his tributary gods, of course commits to several government, and gives them leave to wear their sapphire crowns and wield their little tridents. But this isle, the greatest and the best of all the main, he quarters to his blue-haired deities, and all this tract that fronts the failing sun, a noble peer of mickle trust and power, was in his charge, with tempered awe to guide an old and haughty nation, proud in arms, where his far offspring, nursed in princely lore, are coming to attend their father's state and new entrusted scepter. But their way lies through the perplexed paths of this drear wood, the nodding horror of whose shady brows threats the forlorn and wandering passenger, and here their tender age might suffer peril. But that by quick command from sovereign Jove I was dispatched for their defense and guard. And listen why, for I will tell ye now what never yet was told in tale or song, from old or modern bard in hall or bower. Now again, this idea, something that's never been heard in prose or rhyme, Milton repeatedly is aware of his innovation on form. It seems a repeated emphasis that Milton takes every classical form. I said this to you when I introduced him last week to you, that Milton is attentive to the genres in which he is writing, and yet he will claim, and this is part of his, we might say his arrogance, or we might say his competence, could be either, that he will master the form and dedicate it to its proper end. And here he's doing this with the Masque, which do have female characters, but rather than suggesting that nobility and virtue is attendant upon the queen, will connect nobility and virtue to the female, not just to the queen. So it's an anti-aristocratic impulse. It's pulling it to and applying feminine virtue to all women, potentially. Here's an idealization of women. It's not an idealization of the monarch, the queen, as a figure of virtue that we're all supposed to follow. So it's not like the queen as a representation of the Virgin Mary in front of us. It's rather a portrait of femininity. So that's what he's doing with it. He's giving a Protestant version of how the ideal woman is. It's not the queen. And again, remember, there's a political edge to this as well. Is he criticizing the queen? If so, his life is imperiled. It's a very dangerous thing. He could find himself in prison for criticizing the queen. So what's his angle on it? He is going to tell a tale never yet was heard in tale or song. And as I say, it echoes the opening lines of Paradise Lost. So now he gets to it. But note, he regularly brings to our attention his intention to do something new. Not for the sake of novelty, but for the sake of, and out of a sense that he gets it right where others get it wrong. So why is he writing a Masque? Why does he bother with a very contemporary form? It's because he thinks there's something important that needs to be said that he needs to weigh in on. He's carefully chosen his genre here. So now it begins. Bacchus, that first from out the purple grape crushed the sweet poison of misused wine, after the Tuscan mariners transformed, coasting the Tyrrhene shore, as the winds listed on Circe's island fell, who knows not Circe, the daughter of the sun, whose charmed cup whoever tasted lost his upright shape, and downward fell into a groveling swine. This nymph was gazed upon, his clustering locks with ivy berries wreathed, and his blithe youth had by him ere he parted thence a son much like his father, but his mother more, whom therefore she brought up, and Comus named, who ripe and frolic of his full-grown age, roving the Celtic and Iberian fields, at last betakes him in this ominous wood, and in thick shelter of black shades embowered, excels his mother at her mighty art, offering to every weary traveller his orient liquor in a crystal glass, to quench the drought of Phoebus, which as they taste, for most do taste, though fond intemperate thirst, through fond intemperate thirst, soon as the potion works their human countenance, the express resemblance of the gods is changed into some brutish form of wolf or bear or ounce or tiger, hog or bearded goat, all other parts remaining as they were, and they, so perfect is their misery, not once perceive their foul disfigurement, but boast themselves more comely than before, and all their friends and native home forget, to roll with pleasure in a sensual sty. Therefore, when any favored of high Jove chances to pass through this adventurous glade, swift as the sparkle of a glancing star, I shoot from heaven to give him safe convoy, as now I do. But first I must put off these my sky robes, spun out of iris woof, and take the weeds and likeness of a swain that to the service of this house belongs, who with this his soft pipe and smooth dittied song well knows to still the wild winds when they roar and hush the waving woods, nor of less faith, and in this office of his mountain watch, likeliest and nearest to the present aid of this occasion. But I hear the tread of hateful steps. I must be viewless now. So Comus, who speaks here, represents a spirit that disfigures mankind. It makes them lose the image of God. It makes them become, just as Circe changed men into swine. Remember, Circe gives the men the drink and they become brutish, and she can dominate them and control them. That classical image that he takes from Homer's Odyssey, book 5, Milton is employing here in relation to this figure of Comus. So Comus is a figure, and if you've, and I know some of you did because I remember you from the class, if you've done A Midsummer Night's Dream with me, and The Tempest for that matter, you'll see echoes from Shakespeare's plays in this character of Comus, and the magical power to transform. But here it clearly has something malevolent about it, and it's connected with intoxication. But note that there is a dehumanizing aspect of it, and he specifically talks about the image of God. Their human countenance, the express resemblance of the gods is changed. So the physical form. So that is the threat here, and the threat is of losing your humanity in the process. So Comus is a figure like in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Who is this? Puck. He's a puckish figure of mischief. And it works in particular through the drink. Remember, Puck transformed Bottom into a donkey, got the donkey's ears and all of that. So, and that would be part of this theatrical conventions that Milton's interacting with here. So Comus is the character. Now we've been given his character by the introduction. Now the dreadful steps or hateful steps of a human being are coming in, and he disappears. He becomes viewless. So Comus enters with a charming rod in one hand, his glass in the other. What does he mean by his glass? Of the drink, the cordial in this case. Yep, not a mirror. with him a rout of monsters, headed like sundry sorts of wild beasts, but otherwise like men and women. So people who are intoxicated, who appear, they are male and female, they are people, and yet in their appearance, because of this, they become like wild beasts, just like Circe does. But you could say the result of Bacchus, for that matter, and drinking alcohol. People become disfigured. Remember, this is being presented at a wedding, at a aristocratic wedding at that. And these are people are referred to as monsters here in the description. Their apparel glistering, they come in making a riotous and unruly noise, not without significance. Or, as I say, noise and music, harmony and disharmony are very important for Milton, theologically speaking. The one is a sign of the other. Harmony is a sign of theological correctness, of beauty, of goodness, of truth. Disharmony or riotous and unruly noise is a sign of discord and rebellion against the proper order of things and against God in particular. So don't think it's under. I want to overstate the significance of this because I think it is significant. And as I say, there would be musical accompaniment to this. I don't know how they would have presented the music here, but there would be some sort of beautiful music in the background that would give way to discord, some bad noise at this point, which would announce this crew. And Comus then speaks. The star that bids the shepherd fold, now the top of heavens doth hold, and the gilded car of day his glowing axle doth allay in the steep Atlantic stream, and the slope sun his upward beam shoots against the dusky pole, pacing toward the other goal of his chamber in the east. Meanwhile, welcome joy and feast, midnight shout and revelry, tipsy dance and jollity. Braid your locks with rosy twine, dropping odors, dropping wine. Rigor now is gone to bed, and advice with scrupulous head. Strict age and sour severity with their grave saws in slumber lie. We that are of purer fire imitate the starry choir, who in their nightly watchful spheres lead in swift round the months and years. The sounds and seas with all their finny drove, now to the moon in wavering Morris move, a Morris dance, the type of English folk dancing at May festivals for May Day. They go around a maypole. Have you ever seen a maypole? So it's a pole and it has like a ribbon attached to it, and there are dancers, they're called Morris dancers, still exists as English folk dancing. But it's to fertility. So it's pagan. It's dedicated to, fertility, but also fertility that can be outside of marriage, for that matter. So just fertility, it's not godly fertility. So that aspect there is there as well. Now to the moon in wavering Morris move, and on the tawny sands and shelve trip the pert fairies and the dapper elves. By dimpled brook and fountain brim, the wood nymphs decked with daisies trim, their merry wakes and pastimes keep. Who hath night to do with sleep? What hath night to do with sleep? Night has better sweets to prove. Venus now wakes and wakens love. Come, let us our rites begin. 'Tis only daylight that makes sin, which these dun shades will ne'er report. Hail, goddess of nocturnal sport, dark veiled Cotito, tomb the secret flame of midnight torches, mysterious dame, what ne'er art called but when the dragon womb of Stygian darkness spits her thickest gloom and makes one blot of all the air. Stay thy cloudy ebon stare, wherein doth thou ridst with Hecate, and befriend up thy bowed priest till utmost end of all thy dues be done and none left out, ere the blabbing eastern scout the nice morn on the Indian steep from her cabined loop hole peep, and to the telltale dun descry our concealed solemnity. Come, knit hands, and beat the ground in a light fantastic sound. and the ebony chair, the black chariot, etc. So note that the meter and the rhyme scheme, so it's rhyming couplets, and the metrical feature of this has an incantatory quality. It's a bit like Shakespeare's witches. It also reminds me, just in terms of Shakespeare, this will be our common reference point here, of Shakespeare's use of Ariel, the fairy, commanding her as well. But so Comus has this is a god committed to infidelity and to flout chastity, to be opposed to chastity, to be for promiscuity. That's what he ordains, and that is his intention here. Just again, if you want to appeal to a Midsummer Night's Dream, we have the Oberon and Titania. Remember, there it's the context is a marriage feast, and again, this is dedicated at a marriage feast in Ludlow Castle, and it's going to talk about chastity, the significance of chastity, of female chastity, and what opposes that is the figure of Comus, who's interested more in outright promiscuous, what goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas type. There no moral considerations or constraints. You know, what happens in the dark, nobody's going to see anyway. That's the end of it. Okay, so then the measure. The measure. And as the footnote helpfully notes, a rhythmical performance. In this masque, it would include both dance and music. So at this point, there may be an interlude of some sort. And the manuscript, or the original manuscript, the Trinity manuscript, and also the Bridgewater manuscript specify a wild, rude, and wanton antic. So some sort of chaotic dancing is going on here in response to that. And then at the end of that, then, so after there's this little interlude, Comus, break off. Break off. I feel the different pace of some chaste footing ne'er about this ground. So he's disturbed by the fact that the footsteps of chastity are entering the hallowed venue of discord. Run to your shrouds within these brakes and trees. Our number may affright some virgin sure, for so I can distinguish by mine art, benighted in these woods. Now to my charms, and to my wily trains, I shall ere long be well stocked, with as fair a herd as grazed about my mother's Circe. Thus I hurl by dazzling spells into the spongy air of power to cheat the eye with blear illusion and give it false presentments, lest the place and my quaint habits breed astonishment and put the damsel to suspicious flight, which must not be, for that's against my course. I, under false or fair pretense of friendly ends and well-placed words of glozing courtesy, baited with reasons not unplausible, wind me into the easy-hearted man, and hug him into snares. When once her eye hath met the virtue of this magic dust, I shall appear some harmless villager, whom thrift keeps up about his country gear. But here she comes. I fairly step aside and hearken, if I may, her business here. So his intention here is to pervert her, to deceive her, and to pervert her, just like Satan will intend with Eve, right? It's to misrepresent himself. He will clothe himself as an angel of light, present him as in this case, as a villager, and get under her protective stances. And then I will deceive her and bring her to ruin. And in particular, he mentions how the form of the ruin, it's a sexual perversion that she will be inducted into. No such thing with Eve in Paradise Lost. But here it is. So, the lady enters. And she's heard the discord and the rabble and the riot, and says, "This way the noise was, if mine ear be true, my best guide now. Methought it was the sound of riot and ill-managed merriment, such as the jocund flute or gamesome pipe stirs up amongst the loose, unlettered hinds, when for their teeming flocks and granges full in wanton dance they praise the bounteous Pan and thank the gods amiss. I should be loath." Note that she has a religious sensibility as well. They praise bounteous Pan and thanks the god amiss. They don't practice Orthodox religion. I should be loath to meet the rudeness and swilled insolence of such late wassailers. Yet, oh, where else shall I inform my unacquainted feet in the blind maze of this tangled wood? My brothers, when they saw me wearied out with this long way, resolving here to lodge under the spreading favor of these pines, stepped, as they said, to the next thicket side to bring me berries or such cooling fruit as the kind hospitable woods provide. They left me then, when the gray-hooded Eden, like a sad votarist in Palmer's weeds are closed, and a palmer is a, does it actually have it? Yes, it does. A pilgrim who has a palm leaf as a souvenir from the Holy Land, often referred to by Chaucer and so forth. Palmers. Palmer's weeds were, where have I got that? That was silly of me, jumping away from one text to the next. There it is. Rose from the hindmost wheels of Phoebus' wain. But here they are, and why they came not back is now the labor of my thoughts. 'Tis likeliest they had engaged their wandering steps too far, and envious darkness, ere they could return, had stolen them from me. Else, O thievish night, why shouldst thou, for some felonious end, in thy dark lantern thus close up the stars that nature hung in heaven, and filled their lamps with everlasting oil, to give due light to the misled and lonely traveler? This is the place, as well as I may guess, whence even now the tumult of loud mirth was rife and perfect in my listening ear. Yet naught but single darkness do I find. What might this be? 1,000 fantasies. So she's lost in the woods. In the same way, and I'll remind you of this, those of you who are with me in the Midsummer Night's Dream, when you go into the dark forest, the realm of the imagination awakes. And when the realm of the imagination awakes, it is not a reasonable imagination. It is an imagination that is motivated by your passions and your fears and anxieties. Just like we are when in the dark. You hear a noise in the dark, you imagine the worst. It is a type of imagination, but it's an imagination that's akin to madness and leads you astray. Whereas there's a godly type of imagination more connected with reason and light in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And the reason that they even bother going into the dark forest in A Midsummer Night's Dream is because the reasonable godly light has been perverted in Athens. So they are required to go there for recompense. But anyway, let me not comment on A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's just a parallel text here. And in this case, that's the context of the darkness. You can't see anything. If you can't see, you can't reason. Reason is associated with sight in the classical tradition. So, 1,000 fantasies begin to throng into my memory of calling shapes and beckoning shadows dire, and airy tongues that syllable men's names on sands and shores and desert wildernesses. These thoughts may startle well, but not astound the virtuous mind that ever walks attended by a strong, siding champion conscience. O welcome, pure-eyed faith, white-handed hope, thou flittering angel girt with golden wings, and thou unblemished form of chastity, I see ye visibly. Note that when her earthly sight fails her, she has the inner sight to see virtue and chastity, just as Milton does when he writes Paradise Lost and has lost his visible sight. So in book 3 of Paradise Lost, at the invocation, he talks about the inward sight that he's received as compensation for the loss of his physical sight. Likewise, the lady figure here in the midst of darkness does not give way, as one would expect, to vain, fearful, passionate loss of virtue, but rather sees something that is invisible to her in a physical sense, but not in an internal sense. She's accompanied by virtue wherever she is. So she is a heroic character in this sense. Normally, a character in this context, a woman, would be overcome by the darkness. So she's a superhuman figure in that sense. And not in that sense, not like Shakespeare's presentations. She represents something more than this. She's an ideal. And thou unblemished form of chastity, I see ye visibly, and now believe that he, the supreme good, to whom all things ill are but as slavish officers of vengeance, would send a glistering guardian, if need were, to keep my life and honor unassailed. Was I deceived? So she's fearful of what's going to happen in the dark, but believes that if there were such a threat, that God would send her aid. And therefore, there must be no threat in that sense. Was I deceived, or did a sable cloud turn forth her silver lining on the night? I did not err. There does a sable cloud turn forth her silver lining on the night, and casts a gleam over his tufted grove. I cannot hallow to my brothers, but such noise as I can make to be heard farthest I'll venture. For my new enlivened spirits prompt me, and they perhaps are not far off. So now she breaks into song, which I am not going to attempt for you. You'll be pleased to hear. Sweet echo, sweetest nymph that liv'st unseen within thy airy cell, by slow meanders margent green, and in the violet embroidered vale where the love-lorn nightingale, river in Phrygia, and the nightingale a figure of, well, I'll let you read that. Nightly to thee her sad song mourneth well. Canst thou not tell me of a gentle pair that likes thy Narcissus are? Oh, if thou have hid them in some flowery cave, tell me but where, sweet Queen of Parley, daughter of the sphere, so mayst thou be translated to the skies and give resounding grace to all heaven's harmonies. So, in the presence of darkness, bereft of the help of her brothers who've left her side to give her, to find berries or something, we have a young woman defenseless in the midst of grave threats. Not just the darkness and what might happen to her in the dark, but the fact that there is a figure that intends to despoil her chastity, to bring it about through intoxication, etc. And Comus, having heard her song, is a bit like Satan. And I want you to, when you read Paradise Lost, I want you to consider how Milton's lines here are relating to his portrait. And I think to some degree, if you take this episode and then transpose it into Milton's Paradise Lost, where Satan is overlooking and watching Eve and reflecting upon her, it's very similar to this. He's a Comus-like character, in other words. You can almost, take this poem or this play and then take the lines in Comus's relation to the figure of chastity and virtue and just translate them to be Satan and Eve. And you'll find that they're pretty close. Same sort of sentiment, except no intention to intoxicate her and have her give up her chastity, rather to pervert her and get her to defy God. But otherwise, very similar. So Comus, in response to this display of magnificent virtue and dependence on God, can any mortal mixture of earth's mold breathe such divine, enchanting ravishment? Sure, something holy lodges in that breast, and with these raptures moves the vocal air to testify his hidden residence. How sweetly did they float upon the wings of silence through the empty vaulted night, at every fall smoothing the raven down of darkness, till she smiled. I have oft heard my mother Circe, with the sirens three, amid the flower-kirtled naiads, culling their potent herbs and baleful drugs, who as they sung would take the prisoned soul and lap it in Elysium. Scylla wept and chid her barking waves into attention, and fell Charybdis murmured soft applause. Yet they in pleasing slumber lulled the sense, and in sweet madness robbed it of itself. But such a sacred and home-felt delight, such sober certainty of waking bliss, I never heard till now. I'll speak to her, and she shall be my queen. Hail, foreign wonder, whom certain these rough shades did never breed, unless the goddess that in rural shrine dwells here with Pan or Sylvan, my blessed song forbidding every bleak, unkindly fog to touch the prosperous growth of this tall wood. So it's almost as if the malign purposes of Comus are disarmed by the sheer holiness of the lady. In the same way that we read of Satan when he looks at Eve, of his enmity is almost disarmed by awe at her beauty and the image of her maker fair that he sees in her. His guile, his intention to despoil her and ruin her is almost removed from him, as such as the impression upon him. And again, Milton has this view of the, and when we come to read Eve, I think we want to have that same sense of the glorious feminine in its holy perfection presented, and not Eve as some unthinking figure, which I've never understood anyway. But that's the sort of feminist criticism of him. So he's disarmed of his hostility. I think we'll break in a sec, but let me go to the exchange between the two. The exchange is rather telling. So he hails her, so that in terms of staging, he probably, and it's not presented this, but it's almost like a soliloquy up to that point. And then he turns aside and says, "Hail, foreign wonder." He was speaking to the audience, and now he turns and acknowledges her. And then she, who had not heard him up to that point, hears these words. I'm just imagining the staging here, but now he addresses, rather than the audience and his own thoughts, addresses her. So he'll turn and speak to her, "Hail, foreign wonder," and she responds in kind. "Nay, gentle shepherd, ill is lost that praise that is addressed to unattending ears. Not any boast of skill, but extreme shift how to regain my severed company compelled me to awake the courteous echo to give me answer from her mossy couch." And now note the stichomathia, the quick back and forth, which will reflect, among other things, the excitement of the interaction. And so the tension is high, the conflict, as it were. Just like in Oedipus, which we read, when it comes to short dialogue, it's the figures are animated at this point, and it's not an internal thought process we're being given, but rather interaction between two characters. So, Comus, what chance, good lady, hath bereft you thus? Dim darkness and this heavy levy labyrinth, could that divide you from near ushering guides? From near ushering guides? They left me weary on a grassy turf. By falsehood, or discourtesy, or why? To seek in the valley some cool, friendly spring. And left your fair side all unguarded, lady? They were but twain, and purposed quick return. Perhaps forestalling night prevented them. How easy my misfortune is to hit. Imports their loss, besides the present need? No less than if I should my brothers lose. Were they of manly prime or youthful bloom? As smooth as Hebe's their unrazored lips. So they're just youths. Two such I saw. What time the labored ox in his loose traces from the furrow came, and the swinked hedger at his supper sate. I saw them under a green mantling vine that crawls along the side of yon small hill, plucking ripe clusters from the tender shoots. Their port was more than human. As they stood, I took it for a fairy vision of some gay creatures of the element, that in the colors of the rainbow live and play in the plighted clouds. I was awestruck, and as I passed, I worshipped. If those you seek, it were a journey like the path to heaven, to help you find them. Gentle villager, what readiest way would bring me to that place? Due west, it rises from this shrubby point. Again, put this onto Paradise Lost. Satan telling Eve, I know the way to the tree. Follow me. Same, again, it's just, he just takes this and transposes it into a different context. Very, very similar scene in his mind. Due west, it rises from the shrubby point. To find out that, good shepherd, I suppose, in such a scant allowance of starlight, would overtask the best land pilot's art, without the sure guess of well-practiced feet. I know each lane, and every alley green, dingle or bushy dell of this wild wood, and every bosky bourne from side to side my daily walks in ancient neighborhood. And if your stray attendants be yet lodged, or shroud within these limits, I shall know ere morrow wake, or the low-roosted lark from her thatched pallet rouse. If otherwise I can conduct you, lady, to a low but loyal cottage, where you may be safe till further quest. Shepherd, I take thy word. Yes, it's there. Shepherd, I take thy word, and trust thy honest offer courtesy, which oft is sooner found in lowly sheds with smoky rafters than in tapestry halls and courts of princes, where it first was named. And yet it is most pretended. In a place less warranted than this, or less secure, I cannot be, that I should fear to change it. I me blessed providence, I me blessed providence, and square my trial to my proportioned strength. Shepherd, lead on. I'm going to stop it there. But note here her reference, and this is the political social comment, that virtue and courtesy are best found not in the courts, but rather in lowly places. Again, Milton's awareness of Christ's incarnation and the conditions thereof, and the true courtesy and the true virtue therein is echoed by the lady. And again, it's a rebuke to the courtly manners of Henrietta Maria, and the idea that it's only the aristocrats that can represent Christian virtue to the peasantry. It's rather flipped around by Milton on this. And so she decides, and with this, she is going to see this as a trial, and that's also interesting. So I'll conclude with that, because the two brothers enter in at that point, but we'll pick it up after the break. Okay, so let's take a break.